get right into it. We've been exploring a series that we're calling Life Steps. We've been going through that for the last few weeks. And tonight we're going to continue on and we're going to take the fourth step in our journey. Does anyone happen to know what the fourth step is?
Yeah.
I
don't know. Do you want the AA one?
Sure.
Made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves.
Yeah.
Yay! I knew that.
There we go, that's what I'm looking for.
Cheers.
Smooth right. All right, I put a lot of stuff for
Now, throughout this series, we've been looking to a story in the Bible that Jesus recounts to his followers. And the reason we've been looking at that story is that when we look at it, there are many pieces to it that we can relate to, that line up with our own stories. Can anyone tell me what story we've been looking at and where to find it in the Bibles on the table?
Prodigal son.
Right? Anybody know where to find the prodigal son?
537, no?
What's that?
I was trying to remember. 537? No.
Nope.
Hey, Luke.
It's in Luke, yep. I believe it's page...
It's on my phone.
7,
Oh, it was 7 something.
790.
Nope, close though. 7:30. Evening. Yeah, it's on page 730. It's Luke chapter 15, verses 11 to 31. Like I said, it's on page 730 of the Bibles on the table, so you want to check it out. So let's read the story just to recap and bring us back up to speed as to what's gone on and the steps we've taken so far. So beginning in Luke 15:11, Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set out for a distant country, and then squandered his wealth on wild living. After he'd spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am, starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'" So far we've looked at how the prodigal son, and us by extension, came to realize that in and of his own power, he wasn't able to control his life, to make right choices, and how in fact he always seemed to make the wrong ones. We've seen also how once we recognize that we are powerless, that we also come to recognize that any solution must come from outside ourselves, from God. Last week, like the prodigal son who decided to turn to his father for help, we decided to turn to God for help, for guidance and strength to go through this life we've been given and to keep us on a new path. We are now at the point of our journey where we're moving forward, where this journey of restoration gets some legs under it. In taking our fourth step, we're engaging in the practical tools that will enable us to move to the succeeding steps. This and the steps to come will be a lot of work, but the rewards are amazing and life-changing for those who take them. I'm excited to see what God does in our lives and where He takes us. Are you ready for the next step?
Yes.
So step 4 is where we make a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. Well, what exactly is that? How do we do it? And why do we need to do it? Well, an inventory is an accounting of something, isn't it? Businesses do an inventory to see what they have or don't have in stock, don't they? One of the first jobs I tackled in the kitchen at Freedom's Door 3 months ago was to do a thorough inventory to see what we had, how much we had, what we needed, and who our suppliers were. Doing that set the stage for any future development in the kitchen. Without doing so, it would have been very hard to move forward. Well, this is really not that much different. Step 4 is all about taking stock. Taking stock of ourselves, of our past, and our present. What have we done? How has that affected others? What have our actions done to us? What is it about us today that seems to govern our actions, our responses? This is pen and paper time, people. Writing out stuff helps us to keep and more easily identify things, their connections and their effects. Now, this whole 12-step process is meant to be a journey of restoration, right? Well, ever try to put something from IKEA together without looking at the instructions? I know us guys go, bah, who needs instructions? But it's pretty difficult, isn't it? And we always seem to end up with a piece or two left over. Well, we engage in this inventory so that we can identify actions that have led to or continue to lead us on our old path. We engage in this inventory process so that we can identify what it is about our desires, our needs and wants that have led us where we do not want to go anymore. Now, this can be a very painful process where we have to face things that we'd rather not. In fact, not wanting to face them has probably been a large reason for our engaging in some past behaviors, hasn't it? We've drank or used drugs or lashed out in anger or given control to someone else so that we could hide from things, haven't we? Then we did them again to hide from the shame of doing them again. And the cycle continued, didn't it? Now, unless we identify something, it's pretty hard to change it though, isn't it? Ever want to repaint your car? Just going by the paint shop and talking to the salesman doesn't get it done, does it? Unless you take them out in the parking lot and identify your car to them, it's pretty hard for anything to get done. By identifying our hurts, actions, and desires, by taking an inventory of them, we can begin to move forward toward the restoration that we desire. We desire our new path to be different. But unless we recognize what needs to change, how can we begin to change them, right? Now, in the story of the prodigal son, We're told that the son squandered his money on wild living, and when a famine struck, he hired himself out to a local farmer feeding pigs. Remember last week we talked about how desperate it must have been for him, a Jewish man, to subject himself to a pagan boss and being around unclean animals. We talked about how this situation hadn't arisen overnight, that it would have happened over time, and he chose to ignore the bank statements that kept coming in telling him that money was running out. We're told in that story that a famine overtakes the land. Well, famines don't happen overnight, do they? They're the result of a failed crop season. So why didn't he act sooner and save himself? Well, we've talked before about our amazing ability to self-deceive, haven't we? The truth of the matter is that the son refused to look at what was going on. He refused to look at his actions and see where they were leading him. He refused to look in the mirror and admit what was happening under his watch. Now, we don't do that, do we? We don't refuse to look at ourselves, our actions, and see where they take us, do we? How often do we brush past the mirror, only take quick glances, and then carry on? How often, when we're asked how things are going, do we throw up a mask and say, "Great," when really on the inside our lives are a mess? How many of us have done these things today? Maybe that's how we got here. Now in this story, we're told that the son came to his senses and recognized that he was starving to death. Now I picture him in the washroom one morning at the sink shaving, his focus on the reflection in the mirror of the razor as it glides along, shaving cream disappearing, a trail of clean flesh appearing. Then his view dials back a bit, and for the first time in a long time, he catches his entire reflection in the mirror, and suddenly it strikes him. How on earth did I get here? Perhaps it was the shadows in his sunken cheeks, or the bags under his eyes, or the strain and the look of sadness on his face. But for the first time, he actually holds his eyes on his reflection and takes stock of what he sees. And it isn't pretty, but it does lead to the light coming on, doesn't it? As a result of his recognition, he's able to see the real story and start to take some action to address it, doesn't he? We're told that he recognizes that he has sinned and is going to confess it to his father. The son in this story is in the process of taking the fourth step. You can call them moral failures, bad habits, sins. The title doesn't matter. The son categorizes them as sin, so that's the term that we'll use. But it doesn't really matter. What matters is that the son and us take stock of our lives at this point, our actions, our desires, and our sins, in order that we can identify things that would serve us better if they were changed. Now, there are two initial reactions that we have to taking such an inventory, and both are excuses to not do so. The first is pride, that we don't need to do so. Everyone else is the problem. Our actions are the results of what others have done to us. They need to change, not us. And the second is fear, that we're too afraid of what we'll discover. We're too afraid of change, that we're not up to the task. Now, both of these lines of reasoning I'm here to tell you are bogus and will not serve us to continue on our journey of restoration. Both will sidetrack us, and like every lost person in the bush, we'll find ourselves wandering in circles, repeating the same old cycles. So commit to change. Commit to walking forward and taking the next step in this journey. If you don't think you're up to it, by the way, you're right. That's why we're leaning on a higher power, remember? It's in His strength that we're walking now. So what is it that we should be looking for? Looking to identify? Well, the list can be endless and use a whole bunch of terms, but probably the easiest way to categorize things, since the Son says He's sinned, that was a lot of S's, would be to refer to the list of the 7 deadly sins, namely pride, greed, lust, anger, gluttony, envy, and sloth. When we look at this story, which is only 20 lines long, by the way, we can find examples of each of these things, surprisingly enough. Did I mention this week that we should all dig into the Bible because it has a wealth of wisdom to share? Oh, no, I guess I did. The first thing to look for is pride. The son thought himself all that and a bag of chips at the beginning of the story, didn't he? He thought he knew best how life should be lived. He thought his father owed him something, didn't he? I mean, he went and demanded that his father divide his possessions with him before he even died, didn't he? Then once he got him, he ran off to live the life the way he thought it should be lived, rather than staying under his father's care, didn't he? How often do we think we're owed something? That we're a special case, the exception. How often do we think we know how best to do something, even if the prevailing wisdom says it should be done another way? The second thing is greed. The son, as we just noted, looked at his father's possessions and wanted them for himself, didn't he? He already had access to everything just by being the son, didn't he? So why did he need to possess them? Well, what's the difference between possessing something and simply borrowing it? Both allow us to have access to it. But possessing or owning something allows one to have control, doesn't it? That's what greed is about. The son wanted to control his destiny and the things in it. Well, by the end of the story, we can see how much control he really had, don't we? And how often do we desire to control things? How often do we look at stuff and want it, thinking that having it will give us more control over it and our lives? The next thing is lust. The son, we're told, wasted his money on wild living, on prostitutes. He obviously struggled with lust of the flesh and was willing to give up control of his finances and life to engage in it. Besides lust of the flesh, however, lust can be tied into greed as we lust over things. In the Leonard Skinner song, Simple Man, a son is advised to not lust after rich man's gold. The prodigal son was guilty of lusting after his father's gold and was willing to break their relationship to gain it. How often do we put things ahead of people around us, our families, our friends? How often do we look at someone else and undress them in our minds or engage in fantasy? How do you think we'd feel, or those dearest to us feel, if our thought lives were suddenly broadcast on a big screen for all to see? The next thing is anger. The older brother in the story, we're told, was very angry at his father because he welcomed him back, his son back. He was angry at what he believed was the unfair treatment of himself at the hands of his father, wasn't he? But where does that anger leave him? Outside the party. Outside his home. Remaining in broken relationship with his lost brother. Don't get me wrong, the brother had every right to be angry. His brother had hurt the family and perhaps his brother intended to apologize and beg his forgiveness. along with his fathers. The older brother won't know if you remain in his anger and let it dictate his response. How often do we feel we've been wrong and decide to stay in our righteous anger and punish the other party? Actions have consequences, so we're not saying everything should be forgive and forget. But anger should not become a barrier to restored relationship. It is not righteous then. If anything, it is unrighteous. Because for something to be righteous means for it to be in right relationship with God. And God desires relationship, not its breaking. The next thing to look for is gluttony. The son, we were told, engaged in wild living to the point of wasting all his fortune. He spent everything. He didn't keep anything in reserve, did he? You could say he lived in excess, couldn't we? Well, we aren't like that, are we? How often do we want more? If we were to sit back and look at our situation and what we have, we'd realize that we already have enough. But we want more, don't we? Now, desiring things is not a bad thing. When we allow that desire to control us and negatively impact our well-being or those around us, however, then we're engaging in gluttony. Did you know that if you have a roof over your head, some food in the fridge, and a bank account with a couple bucks in it, you're in the top 2% of the richest people in the world? Just something to think about when we're considering upgrading our 40-inch TV to a 52 because we need a bigger picture. Another thing to look for is envy. There are a number of examples of envy in this story. Not all of them bad. The son obviously was envious of his father's position and wealth at the beginning of the story. That's what led him to demand his share at the risk of breaking their relationship. The older brother, we can see, is envious of the treatment given his brother by their father when he confronts him about never being given a party for himself and his friends. Again, we can see how the brother's engagement in this feeling is actually stopping him from enjoying a party being thrown by his father. Now, we don't do these type of things, do we? We never look at our boss and demand a raise because the company had a successful year, do we? Even if it wasn't our department that was responsible. Or we never look at a blessing given to a friend by someone and feel slighted because we didn't get something too, do we? I said a moment ago that there is a good example of envy, and that might be stretching things a bit, but I think you'll understand what I mean. The son, while he's feeding the pigs, looks enviously at their food because he is hungry, we're told. Now, I say this is good envy because it prompts him to take some action to change his situation. Maybe it's not envy at all, but finally recognition of his situation. Whichever it is, it leads him to take action. Do we do that sometimes too? Look at something someone has, whether it's a possession or their health or whatever, and it makes us decide that we need to change something so that we can enjoy those fruits as well. And the last of the 7 deadly sins we need to look for is sloth. The prodigal son blew everything, didn't he? We looked earlier at how this did not happen overnight. It wasn't a surprise. It wasn't a stock market crash, but a sustained habit of ignoring the truth and failure to act, wasn't it? Call it laziness, procrastination, inability to face the truth, whatever. He didn't take any action to change the course he was on and ended up reaping the rewards, starving, feeding pigs. But we don't do that, do we? We don't not open that bill that came in the mail. We don't put off having that discussion with our spouse or friend that would help us to be accountable, do we? We don't go back for seconds and think to ourselves, We'll go to the gym tomorrow, right? Now these are the things that this fourth step of our journey is calling us to look at in our lives. By taking the time to identify them, we can then have a starting point from which to move forward from and engaging in change. Next week, when we look at the fifth step, we'll see how that change begins and the process of restoration gains some breath of life. But tonight I want to leave us with two thoughts. One that speaks to our journey today, and the other to tomorrow. The first is that in this process of self-examination, this fourth step is like what we found ourselves doing in the kitchen the other day at work. We had a box of green beans come in as a donation. They were from a local supplier and were nearing their expiry date, so that's why they were being passed on. When we dug through them to prep for supper, we found a few moldy ones in the mix, and we had to pick them out. We needed to go through the entire box, sorting and identifying the bad ones, so they could be tossed, and we could enjoy the good ones for supper that day. We were doing a step 4 on that box of beans, identifying the bad stuff today, so we could enjoy the rest today. The second thing I want to leave us with is that this process, this step 4, not only serves us today, but serves us tomorrow and the next. Because as we identify these things in our life that lead us where we don't want to be, we get better at identifying them in the future early enough to take action and avoid them before they sidetrack us again. So I encourage us all to dig into this 4th step. Spend some time thinking about our past behaviors, what motivates us, and our actions. Spend some time in prayer, asking for guidance as we consider these things. Ask God to give us some insight, some clarity, so that we can begin to pick these bad beans out and enjoy the fruits of our labors. God bless us in our journey. When we wrap up here in a minute, I hope everyone's going to stick around because we have coffee and there's warm coffee cake this week. And that time of just hanging out, getting to know each other, we think is some of the most important time of the evening. So I hope everybody can do that. Now may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. May the Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. May you keep the rubber side down and your eyes fixed on him. God bless, and I'll see you next week for the next part of our journey.